Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we'll be doing more ideas and opinions. Albert Einstein. First, we are going to read two pieces. First piece we're going to read is called "The Institute of Intellectual Cooperation," and it says it was probably written in 1926. Published in Mijn Weltbild, Amsterdam, Gerrido Verlag, 1934. During this year, the leading politicians of Europe have for the first time drawn the logical conclusion from the realization that our continent can only regain its prosperity of the latent struggle between traditional political unit cases, or between political units ceases. If the latent struggle between the traditional political units ceases, the political organization of Europe must be strengthened and a gradual attempt made to abolish tariff barriers. This great end cannot be achieved by treaties alone. The minds of the people must, above all, be prepared for it. We must try gradually to awaken in them a sense of solidarity which will not, as heretofore, stop at frontiers. It is with this in mind that the League of Nations created the Commission de Coopération Intellectuelle. This commission was to be a strictly international and entirely non-political body, whose business it was to put the intellectuals of all the nations who were isolated by the war in touch with each other. It proved a difficult task, for it has, alas, to be admitted that, at least in the countries with which I am most closely acquainted, the artists and men of learning permit themselves to be governed by narrow nationalism to a far greater extent than the men of affairs. Hitherto, this commission has met twice a year. To make in efforts more effective, the French government has decided to create and mainstream a permanent institute of intellectual cooperation, which is just now to be opened. It is a generous act on the part of the French government, and as such deserves the thanks of all. It is an easy and grateful task to rejoice and praise and to say nothing about the things one regrets or disapproves of. But honesty alone can help our work forward. So I will not shrink from combining criticism with the greeting to the newborn child. I have daily occasion for observing that the greatest obstacle which the work of our commission has to encounter is the lack of confidence in its political impartiality. Everything must be done to strengthen that confidence, and anything avoided that might harm it. When, therefore, the French government sets up and maintains an institute out of public funds in Paris as a permanent organ of the Commission, with the Frenchman as its director, The outside observer can hardly avoid the impression that French influence predominates in the commission. This impression is further strengthened by the fact that a Frenchman has also been chairman of the commission itself thus far, although the individuals in question are men of the highest reputation, esteemed and respected everywhere. Nevertheless, the impression remains. Dixi et salveri animum meum, or meum. I hope with all my heart that the new institute, by constant interaction with the Commission, will succeed in promoting their common ends and winning the confidence and recognition of intellectual workers all over the world. So, yeah. Einstein talking about the need for intellectual cooperation worldwide, but the problem with it seeming that it's overly dominated by the French because it's set up in Paris, because the people over it are French. Even though he feels it is so important to have. Let's look this up right quick. Dixi et Savari. There it is. It's Latin for I have spoken and saved my soul. So, yeah, that's what that means. So, while Einstein felt there would be many disagreements with that, he felt it was something he had to say. But we're going to read one more piece. This one's a bit of a long one. 1, 2.5, 3, almost 4 full pages. So bear with me as I read this. It is called Thoughts on the World Economic Crisis. This and the following 2 articles were written during the world economic crisis of the 1930s. Although prevailing conditions are not the same and some of the suggested remedies have been used by various countries, these articles should be included. And they were published in Mein Weltbild, Amsterdam, Carido Verlag, 1934. If there is anything that can give a layman in the sphere of economics the courage to express an opinion on the nature of the alarming economic difficulties of the present day, it is the hopeless confusion in opinions among the experts. What I have to say is nothing new and does not pretend to be anything more than the expression of the opinion of an independent and honest man who, unburdened by class or national prejudices, desires nothing but the good of humanity and the most harmonious possible scheme of human existence. If in what follows I write as if I were sure of the truth of what I am saying, this is merely done for the sake of an easier mode of expression. It does not proceed from the unwarranted self confidence or a belief in the infallibility of my somewhat simple intellectual conception of problems which are in reality uncommonly complex. As I see it, this crisis differs in character from past crises or crises in that it is based on an entirely new set of conditions arising out of the rapid progress on methods of production. Only a fraction of the available human labor in the world is now needed for the production of a total amount of consumption goods necessary to life. Under a completely laissez-faire economic system, this fact is bound to lead to unemployment. For reasons which I do not propose to analyze here, the majority of the people are compelled to work for the minimum wage on which life can be supported. If two factories produce the same sort of goods, other things being equal, that factory will be able to produce them more cheaply, which employs fewer workmen, i.e., makes the individual worker work as long and as hard as human nature permits. From this, it follows inevitably that the methods of production as they are today, only a portion of the available labor can now be used. While unreasonable demands are made on this portion, the remainder is automatically excluded from the process of production. This leads to a fall in sales and profits. Businesses go smash, which further increases unemployment and diminishes confidence in industrial concerns and therewith public participation in the mediating banks. Finally, the banks become insolvent through the sudden withdrawal of accounts, and the wheels of industry therewith come to a complete standstill. The crisis has also been attributed to other causes which will now consider. Overproduction. We have to distinguish between two things here: real overproduction and apparent overproduction. By real overproduction, I mean a production so great that it exceeds the demand. This may perhaps apply to motor cars and wheat in the United States at the present moment, although even that is doubtful. By overproduction, people usually mean a condition in which more than one of a particular article is produced than can, in existing circumstances, be sold, in spite of a shortage of consumption goods among consumers. This I call apparent overproduction. In the case in this case, it is not the demand that is lacking, but the consumer's purchasing power. Such apparent overproduction is only another word for a crisis and therefore cannot serve as an explanation of the latter. Hence, people who try to make overproduction responsible for the present crisis are merely juggling with words. Reparations. The obligation to pay reparations lies heavy on the debtor nations and their economies. It compels them to go in for dumping and so harms the creditor nations too. This is beyond dispute, and the appearance of the crisis in the United States, in spite of the high tariff wall, proves that this cannot be the principal cause of the world crisis. The shortage of gold in the debtor countries due to reparations can at most serve as an argument for putting an end to these payments. It cannot provide an explanation of the world crisis. Erection of new tariff walls. Increase in the unproductive burden of armaments. Political insecurity owing to latent danger of war. All of these things are the situations in Europe considerably worse without really affecting America. The appearance of the crisis in America shows that they cannot be its principal causes. The dropping out of the two powers, China and Russia. Also, this blow to world trade cannot make itself very deeply felt in America and therefore cannot be principal cause of the crisis. The economic rise of the lower classes since the war. This, supposing is to be a reality, could only produce a scarcity of goods, not an excessive supply. It will not weary the reader by enumerating further contentions which do not seem to me to get to the heart of the matter. If one thing I feel certain, this same technical progress, which in itself might relieve mankind of a great part of the labor necessary to its subsistence, is the main cause of our present misery. Hence, there are those who would, in all seriousness, forbid the introduction of technical improvements. This is obviously absurd. The introduction of technical but how can we find a more rational way of out of our dilemma? If we could somehow manage to prevent the purchasing power of the masses, measured in terms of goods, from sinking below a certain minimum, stoppages in the industrial cycle, such as we are experiencing today, would be rendered impossible. And the logically simplest, but also most daring method of achieving this is a completely planned economy in which consumption goods are produced and distributed by the community. That is essentially what is being attempted in Russia today. Much will depend on what results this forced experiment produces. To hazard a prophecy here would be presumption. Can goods be produced as economically under the system as under one which leaves more freedom to individual enterprise? Can this system maintain itself at all without the terror that has so far accompanied it, to which none of us Westerners would care to expose himself? Does such does not such a rigid centralized economic system tend toward protectionism and toward resistance to advantageous innovations? We must take care, however, not to allow these misgivings to become prejudices, which prevent us from forming an objective judgment. My personal opinion is that those methods are in general preferable, which respect existing traditions and habits so far as that is in any way compatible with the end in a view. Nor do I believe that a sudden transference of economy into governmental management would be beneficial from the point of view of production. Private enterprise would be left its sphere of activity insofar as it has not already been eliminated by industry itself by the device of cartelization. There are, however, two respects in which this economic freedom ought to be limited. In each branch of industry, the number of working hours per week ought to be reduced by law that unemployment is systematically abolished. At the same time, minimum wages must be fixed in such a way that the purchasing power of the workers keeps pace with production. Further, to those industries which have become or monopolistic in character through organization on the part of the producers, prices must be controlled by the state in order to keep the issue of capital within reasonable bounds and prevent the artificial strangling of production and consumption. In this way, it might perhaps be possible to establish a proper balance between production and consumption without too great a limitation of free enterprise, and at the same time to stop the intolerable tyranny of the owners and the means of production, land, and machinery over the wage earners in the widest sense of the term. So, yeah. So, Einstein in this is referring to the economic crisis of the 1930s, the Great Depression, which was worldwide. It wasn't just an American thing, because he's talking about it has finally even hit America. And, at this point, we're still fighting for many of the things we have today, like 40-hour work weeks, minimum wage, which a lot of this is even being pushed back against by businesses today, corporations and the rich, which we need somebody to push back on the corporations and the rich, which is what Einstein is saying. You know, wage, what workers are paid must go up in um, coordination with production. Um, essentially, if the worker doesn't have enough money to spend, then the production does no good. You're overproducing goods. And that's a lot of what's happening now. Wages have gotten so stagnant, but prices keep rising. You know, the worker needs more wages to be able to afford living. And if he has the money to spend to help afford living, that helps businesses survive too. But too many rich people don't see this. They're just money, 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 money. Also, Einstein does talk, we need to keep an eye on the experiment of communism in Russia, because at that time it was a fairly new thing. Uh, it only became a communist state after World War One. So at in the late 1918, 1919, 1920, in that era. And this is from the 1930s. So they're still watching how communism affects Russia, how that system economically will work. And he warns, while we must be wary, we cannot let prejudices affect our view. We must keep an open mind when observing, which unfortunately in the US it became a prejudice, you're a communist with the Red Scare and everything else. So. But that will be it for now. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.